Hi, everybody. Welcome to my presentation on the overlooked security risk, third-party risk management. So this topic is particularly near and dear to my heart. I've actually given this talk quite a few times on third-party risk management. Um, Being in the field that I work in, which is governance, risk, and compliance, one of the things that I see that organizations always overlook is third-party risk. And a couple years ago, it was getting pretty bad. We were seeing a lot of breaches due to third parties and their lack of response or lack of security controls within their environment. Recently, within the past year or so, we've seen an uptick in companies taking third-party risk management more seriously, especially after seeing huge things like solar winds happen. And it really brings home the seriousness of assessing your third parties, especially if something has happened to them and they have compromised your data in any way or caused you not to be able to have availability within your environment or anything that may impact you due to a third party not having the correct things in place. So this presentation is going to take you through the whole life cycle of what third-party risk management should look like, and how you can implement it at your organization. And then it will take it a step further. So here's all the things that we need to do for our program, but how can we automate it so that way we are having less and less impact to the people performing these processes? Because anytime we have a new control, a new expectation of us within security, we tend to know it's going to take a lot of steps. It's going to be manual. We're going to have to devote all this other work. So where can we implement the controls and have a secure environment, or assess our third parties and make sure they're doing the things that they need to, but also minimize impact to our teams by building in automation where automation can be built in. Um, and that's not to say that you need a tool, you need some fancy GRC tool or something like that. Automation can absolutely be built with tools that you may have in your environment today. So I have a demo a little bit later in this presentation where I'll take you through how I implemented automation within third-party risk management using tools that I have available to me. I've implemented third-party risk management leveraging a custom-built platform that was designed for a particular organization. And I have designed programs that are entirely manual, or they're reaching the next step of maturity, which is automation, but maybe they don't have the funds to purchase the tools. So we'll dig into that as part of the presentation today. So first off, a little bit about me. My name is Rose. I currently live in Pittsburgh. I have two kids, one's 11 and one's 9. We love living in the Pittsburgh area. We've lived all over the place. We've lived in San Diego, California. We lived in Hawaii, Mississippi, which is where I grew up. So a lot of different areas all over the United States. So this is the reason I do the things that I do. And my kids have started to get more and more interested in cybersecurity, to the point that my son, who's 11, has started reading my Security Plus books, which is great. That's what I want to hear. I want to hear him wanting to be interested in security. So on the professional side, though, I work in governance, risk, and compliance. I am a consultant. So what I do is I work with organizations that maybe don't have any security posture, or they're maturing their programs, or they're doing stuff that they need compliance help with. They need to understand where their gaps are and stuff like that. So my role is to come in within the governance, risk, and compliance realm and come in and give them either advice on how they should do things or help them implement these items. So I also have a master's in cybersecurity and information assurance, and I have a bachelor's in advanced networking. I've been in security for quite some time now, roughly 8 to 9 years, and a lot of years in technology. I joined the United States Navy when I was 18 and immediately was in information technology. And by the time that I got out, I was in network engineering. And then once I got out, I navigated really to the security side and how to secure environments. So a lot of my experience goes over retail, higher education, government. The big one though for me is healthcare. So dealing a lot with protected healthcare information or protected health information, dealing with the HIPAA security rule. All right, so what are third parties? Why are we talking about them? Why are they concerning? So third parties, they're everywhere. Or organization, there's probably not an organization in the entire world at this point that does not use third parties in some capacity, whether they're providing your infrastructure, whether you're using their online tools, whether you're asking for their help like a consultant. So third parties have become really ingrained into how a business tends to operate, especially when businesses are trying to offset the cost of, should we do it internally or should we do it outsourced? Will it be cheaper outsourced? And a lot of times the answer is yes, it will be cheaper outsourced. But there's some risks that you have to assess there. For the return on investment of outsourcing, are you trading that for risk to your data or your environment? So organizations will tend to look at the bottom line when it comes to third parties and want to have the most bang for their buck. What's not happening enough is, what are the risks associated with working with these third parties, and are we communicating them sufficiently? So our role in security is making sure that we're being liaisons or facilitating these conversations so that they understand how important it is that we continue to assess these third parties and make sure that the business is doing things as secure as possible, especially if any of that data is being transferred out of your control. So third-party risk management, essentially this program is going to use a due diligence process to assess the controls that a vendor has in place. So essentially what you're looking at is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data or their environment. You want to understand, what are they doing within their environment and what are they not doing? More importantly, what are they not doing, right? So you want to know, what are these things that they have in their environment that they maybe aren't doing? Maybe they aren't doing pen tests. Maybe they don't have vulnerability scanning going on. Maybe they don't do risk management. What are all these things that we care about as an org? And some things your organization may not care about. They may not care that a third party doesn't have governance in place, but they're sure going to care that they don't have vulnerability management in place. So it's all about assessing those vendors and doing the due diligence, which we'll touch on as part of this presentation. And like I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, we're really facilitating these conversations with the business. So ultimately, we want to make sure that the business is making risk-aware decisions when it comes to working with those third parties or those vendors. So us doing our job is making sure that they understand why they should not work with vendors. And if they decide to work with a vendor, having them do a risk acceptance form and making sure that someone owns that risk, because it sure isn't security. Security shouldn't be owning these risks. Security should be putting those risks on the business when the business is supposed to own them. So TPRM, you use it to assess your third parties that are providing your organization with services. So whatever they may be doing, if they're going to remote into your environment, if they're going to have access to your data, if they're going to store your data within their environment, you absolutely want to be assessing them. So the vendor lifecycle, I have it highlighted here on the screen. When I initially got into doing third-party risk management, which was several years ago, probably around 2018, one of the things that was highly frustrating to me was I needed to establish a program, but I couldn't find really good information on it. Like I knew, okay, I need to do risk assessments on these vendors, but I didn't know what the flow should look like. What are the things that we should do within this life cycle? And so I went on a trial by fire, if you will, where I figured out, okay, these are all the things that should be happening within my program. And at the time, I was just a normal employee at a company. It wasn't until a year later that I went to be a consultant. And so I took this knowledge and started applying it at other companies. So your vendor life cycle is from the onset. What happens to your vendor while it's going through these processes? So the very first part of the life cycle is your governance, policy, standard, and procedure around your program, around your vendors, around the things that you do. That governance is going to stabilize your program and make sure that the entire organization understands the expectations. A lot of times, if you don't have the governance established, it's going to be very difficult for you to get the employees to adhere to the processes that you want to have established, because they don't have anything to point to. They don't know, like, oh, okay, the policy says that all critical vendors must get a risk assessment. Well, you don't have that policy available to them. So it's harder for them to adhere to these things that we're asking them to do. Next is planning. So once you have your governance in place and you get it out to the workforce and they're trained on it, at one point your workforce will decide, okay, I need to bring a vendor in, and this is where they start planning. They're doing, requests for proposals, and they're detailing out the criteria and expectations of the vendors and all these other things. And normally security isn't overly involved in this. I will say though, if you can integrate yourself into the planning phase when they're trying to figure out the request for purchases and all those other things, developing a red flag checklist or facilitating conversations at this point will greatly reduce the chances of you getting a vendor that really is not good to work with before you do all the things that we're going to talk about here in a second within due diligence. So during the planning phase, you can develop something for your procurement team or whoever may assist with bringing vendors into the company, and say, what are these things that are super concerning to us in security? Have they had a breach? Will they have, super critical data? Will they need remote access into the environment? Will they sign an information security agreement or a contract? And, have some red flag questions that whenever procurement starts working with these vendors, the vendors like, oh, we're not going to sign your agreement. Yep, we did have a breach, or these other things. Okay, well, now you can, before you start to do your due diligence, you can say, well, hey guys, let's take a second. Should we really be working with this vendor, or is there another one that possibly has the services that you want to use? So you could use the planning phase for that if you'd like. Additionally, we have due diligence. So I'm not going to touch on due diligence too much. We're going to cover that in detail through each of the parts. Next, we have contract negotiation. So once you do your due diligence should happen before contracting. Contract negotiation is going to happen. So signing master service agreements, signing non-disclosure agreements, signing information security agreements, or an agreement that covers security controls are going to be contained within the contract negotiation. The reason you want to stage due diligence before that is your legal team or whoever's facilitating the contracting process needs to know what risk came out of the due diligence. That way we can try to address them during the contracting phase. So maybe the vendor, like I said, they don't do vulnerability management, and you find out during due diligence, during contract negotiation, you may be able to build it into the contracts that it is a requirement that they put in vulnerability management within 9 months, or whatever parameters you want to establish around it. So entirely up to the organization if you want to pursue that route. Definitely a route that you can take to get the things in place that you want or you expect for these vendors. So next we have ongoing monitoring. Ongoing monitoring is the annual recycles of assessing the vendor and their due diligence controls. So based on the criticality of the vendor, you may assess them on certain cadences. You may decide that you're going to assess them, once a year, or if they are a low rated vendor, you may do it every 2 years. Whatever your parameters are, which are established in your governance, you'll continue to monitor them. And once you do that, it's like a little mini due diligence. You do the risk assessments again, you review their independent attestations, whatever they have, and you report those findings to the vendor owner and likely someone in security that's above you, so they're aware that these findings came up. This will also allow you to figure out, all right, so that same vendor that didn't have vulnerability management in place, did they implement? And you can find out during your ongoing maintenance. And then finally, you have termination. So at some point, you're likely going to stop working with a vendor. Termination should include, did they have access to data? Did they have access, or did they store data in their environment? Are they providing a certificate of destruction? If they had an access into our account, are we deprovisioning their accounts and removing their access? And all these other things that go within terminating or ending that relationship with them. So you want to make sure they don't have any of your data, unless there's legal or compliance requirements stating that they have to keep them for a particular duration. And you want to remove their access and make sure that they don't have access anywhere that they shouldn't. So that's the vendor cycle, and that's what it looks like. Next, we're going to dig into the due diligence part and talk about all the different steps that are included in there. So you have one giant life cycle, but then you have some mini steps that occur within due diligence. Okay, so the scope. Ideally, whenever you go to assess these vendors, you want to know the scope of what they're doing. This is going to better facilitate the process whenever you're trying to assess the risk associated with this vendor. You want to know data classification. So data classification is entirely up to you as an organization. You may rate the vendors using public, confidential, and something else. You may say regulated. Just depends on what your organization has set up. Normally, these classifications will identify what types of data they may have, whether or not they'll have impact to business continuity. So let's say the vendor may pose an availability risk or things like that. So you'll want to look at data classification and make sure it pairs up with your vendors and how you tier them. You'll also want to know if this vendor is going to store, transmit, or process data. Anytime that data is leaving your control, you want to do anything and everything possible to make sure that you know that that data is being handled with the utmost care, with all the expectations happening. You also want to know if they need remote access into your environment. So are we provisioning them an account? Are we going to make sure we do them as part of access reviews? What are they going to have access to within our environment and things like that? So remote access is really important to make sure that we understand as we assess these vendors. Next, we'll also look if they provide software as a service. So a lot of times with software as a service, you won't be able to modify those controls, or there's things that will be out of your control. So assessing that and figuring out how we better protect that data will be one of the scoping items that we take care of. Additionally, with SaaS, you'll want to make sure that there's certain things configured as part of the risk assessment that you're addressing. So once you do the scoping is done. It can be done via a form that someone within the organization, normally the vendor owner, will fill out. You move into the risk assessment. So again, you're assessing the overall security posture of this company. You use standard questionnaires. So some organizations will use questionnaires that you can purchase online. I think there's a few floating out there, shared information gathering or something or other. You can also build it yourself. So if your organization has particular concerns that you care about, you may opt to build it yourself. There are expectations that you have within these questionnaires to make sure you address all the controls. And I think we will touch on that on the next slide on how you capture all these different areas. You can also use certain artifacts to be able to validate their responses. So you can use independent certifications or reports. So ISO 27001, you could get a SOC report, you could get an attestation of compliance. Any independent type report that's going to say, yep, they have these controls in place. We tested this criteria. We got these results. And so now you have an independent party verifying that they in fact did this. You can also do artifact reviews. So entirely up to you. Now, if you are trying to streamline your process and make it as painless as possible, you may not necessarily want to do a lot of artifact reviews. This needs to be decided as an organization, where you decide if that is something that you want to pursue. Artifact reviews will typically be a lot of governance or other artifacts that the vendor is willing to provide. I personally have seen a lot of governance, and I'm okay with getting the governance, but you don't want to hit the slippery slope of having the vendors provide their confidential or proprietary data, because then you're in a position of making sure that you protect it. So take that with a grain of salt and figure out what you would like to see from your third parties to be able to figure out whether or not they're secure. And then you can also do on-site audits. I personally have never experienced doing an on-site audit of a third party to assess their controls. I have come in contact with people that have done that. That can get really pricey, or you can build it into the contract that you have with the third party that they are to provide support of the on-site audits. Again, if you're trying to streamline your processes and make it as painless as possible, that might not be the most viable path. Best path is likely using those independent certifications that they've already done all the hard work for you. They've already tested everything. You just have to validate it, read it, compare it against the questionnaire that they likely provided, and then summarize those results. Last thing here is you want to do a consistent analysis by using risk scoring. So what I mean here is that each question receives its own score based on the criticality of the vendor. So let's say you have 3 tiers of vendor. You have, high, moderate, and low, and those tiers are based on data classification and what the vendor has access to. You may want to establish risk scoring on those different tiers, or you may say all vendors are created equal and you just have the same risk scoring for each of them. That really depends on the level of granularity that your organization wants to do. Just make sure you have risk scoring. It's going to make your life a lot easier, especially as you go to do your analysis and you're summarizing those findings. You can say, this is a moderate rating because of fill in the blank of whatever that is. This is a critical finding because they don't have vulnerability management in place, and you can summarize those results better with those risk scoring. So with the risk assessment, you want to target certain areas. If you're going to do a risk assessment, you want to make sure that you are assessing everything that you possibly can in one big swoop. You don't want to have to go back to these vendors and ask for more information because your questionnaires weren't built right from the onset. So you want to have governance, you want to have risk management, you want to have asset management, identity and access management, threat and vulnerability management, situational awareness and information sharing, incident response and recovery, vendor risk management, workforce management, and data protection. Those are 10 different areas. You want to have some variation of those different areas within your questionnaire. That is going to give you a holistic view into your third parties and how they're managing their program, how they have their security program set up. Are they managing risk on within a program? Are their assets being tracked through their life cycle? Do they have owners assigned to it? For access management, are they adhering to the principle of least privilege and making sure that a lot of people don't have access to things that they shouldn't? So all of these areas are going to be super critical that you're assessing with these vendors. Additionally, you could also use the NIST cybersecurity framework as a way to build out your questionnaire. So if you are building your questionnaire completely from scratch, you can use that framework in order to build out the type of questions that you want to ask of your third parties. It has these 5 different areas in it, and the 5 different areas cover the 10 functional areas that I just mentioned on this slide. So doing a quick Google search will likely return a lot of good results on developing these questionnaires and making sure that you have it built out correctly. Now, once you get these questionnaires built out, or just one questionnaire, you'll want to make sure that you have review and approval of the questionnaire before you start pushing it out to the vendors. So making sure your chief information security officer has reviewed and said, yes, this questionnaire is good to review, or someone else within the business, just to make sure that that questionnaire is in alignment with the things that you want to be assessing of these third parties. So you receive the questionnaire back and you do your analysis. Sometimes you won't have any findings. I won't say it's rare. Nowadays, there's a lot of companies that are doing the right things. I will say though, it's like half and half. You're gonna have vendors that are gonna have findings. They may have a little bit, they may have a lot. You're gonna have vendors that don't have any findings, and those are gonna be the really breezy ones where you're not gonna have to sit and type up a bunch of things. You're just gonna be able to say they don't have any findings. Now, for the vendors that do have findings, you're gonna need to do an analysis of them. And this is where the risk scoring comes into play. Of the things that you found within their environment, what are the ratings for them? What's the risk associated with that finding? And communicating that to the business. When we get into the demo here in a couple minutes, you'll be able to see that using Excel, you can build in auto scoring. So you set up those risk scores and you say, all right, anything that is lower than a 10 or whatever number that you come up with is acceptable. And so if you have buy-in from your organization that says, we don't care what the findings are, if they score acceptable based on our risk scoring, we're not going to do any further analysis of them. They're going to be automatically approved to move through the process. Now, that is entirely up to your organization and how they want to be able to assess these vendors. I will say though, if you are an organization setting up third-party risk management for the first time, I would not do this. With your programs that you're standing up for the first time, I like to think of it as a house. You have to build the foundation, which is sometimes a lot of manual processes, and then you can start building the rest of the house. You want to make sure that you have everything set up from the onset and that you know that your program's operating effectively. Now, I'm not saying that it can't be done. I'm just saying that sometimes you may not want to take that route until you know that your program is operating the way that you want it to. So once you have items found, you can sometimes get the vendors to remediate, depending on how much you want to push on that. Organization may opt not to push on vendors remediating and rather documenting it through a risk acceptance form. It really depends or comes down to what the finding is and how risky that is to your organization. If it's a low risk, you're not going to do anything about that. If it's a critical risk, again, they don't have vulnerability management in place, then your organization may be more inclined to push on the remediation. That's just going to have some dialogue that happens within the business to figure out if that's an acceptable path to take. So, findings that cannot be remediated, whether you decide to push for it or not, should be documented. Using a consistent form is going to be your best friend. You want to have this form be the same every time because you're going to have a lot of the same risk. A lot of organizations are going to have, fill in the blank. They're not going to have vulnerability management in place, or they're not going to have certain components of a program in place. You'll want to make sure that you can keep these forms as consistent as possible. It will make your life easier, especially if your organization is processing a lot of vendors. So your risk acceptance form should include all the scoping information that you can. It should include the risk level of the vendor, the risk that you found, who's the vendor owner, a business justification of why you're working with this vendor, even though it's risky, all of that information that you want to have on either a single piece of paper or 2 pieces of paper to document that particular risk. And then all of the risks should roll up to enterprise risk management so you can track them. That way you can start to understand how your risk tolerance associated with vendors is being addressed through the entire org. You can also see, if you do it that way, where certain business units have the most risk associated with them from working with vendors. So let's say you have 3 business units. We have legal, we have human resources, and we have technology. In enterprise risk management, they see all of the risks through the entire organization, and they say, wow, technology, you have a lot of risk associated with vendors. What are you doing about this? Your group is posing the most risk to the organization by the third parties that you use. So it allows you to get like that holistic high level view of the groups that are using too many vendors and posing a lot of risks to the organization. It may also push for additional conversation where you say, why aren't we doing this in-house? You know, because when you have these one-off instances of using a vendor happening and they're so spread apart that it's hard to see that top level view of the risk being posed to the organization. With an enterprise risk management, you'll be able to see, oh man, technology, they have a critical scoring and risk because they use all these vendors. So it's a good view, a good way to communicate that to management as well. All right, so last, you can do a scorecard. So scorecard, it's a consistent report deliverable. It is not a must of your program. In fact, the only real must of your program is that you scope, you do the risk assessment, and you do a risk acceptance form. Scorecard, not a requirement. It's a nice perk though for your vendor owners to be able to understand how their vendors are doing within the environment. So you want to have a consistent report deliverable. You want to communicate the key components of the risk associated with that vendor, even if they are an acceptable vendor. Indicate their overall score. So your organization may rate them, give them a good rating. I don't know, whatever parameters you want to say, like, all right, acceptable vendors that scored below 10 get A+. And that way the vendor owner understands A+, oh, that means they did really good, and put it in a way that they can consume it and do something with the information. The scorecard will also indicate any need for risk acceptance form. So you can have it all summarized on this nice piece of paper that says, hey, vendor owner, these are the risks. You have a risk of form associated with this vendor. This is their current scoring, and it gives them all that information on a pretty page for them. So that's the last part of the due diligence life cycle there. So like I said, you have the vendor life cycle, that circle, right? And we have the due diligence component of it. And the due diligence component, as you see, it has multiple steps within it. And this process can get quite complicated the larger and bigger that your organization gets, because you have all these different pieces working within this vendor life cycle. I have seen a lot of vendors slip through the cracks because communication wasn't happening, people weren't getting the right training, governance wasn't in place to govern your program. So all of these things are really going to play a key role into developing this program so that it works in the way that you need it to, the way that you need to understand risk associated with these third parties or vendors. So what now? What do I do to make this easier for myself? So all I've been saying this entire presentation is, oh my gosh, there's so many things that I have to do, so many things I need to do to make sure my organization stays secure. But how do I make it easier for myself? Because Rose just killed me with all of these different things I need to do, all of these steps I need to take into consideration. And it does not sound easy, right? It sounds kind of painful when you look at all these different steps and all these different things that we need to do. And I mean, being quite frank with you, it is painful. It's hard to stand up these programs that are highly driven off compliance requirements and other expectations. It can get quite complicated, and that's why you have to break it down to these individual pieces to understand how they play a part within your organization. So there's a way to make it easier for yourself, and it is automation. Now, when I say automation, you either run for the hills and you're like, yes, let me hear all the things about automation. Now, the thing about automation is a lot of times when you say that word, people will tend to think, oh man, I'm going to need a tool. I'm going to need to spend all of these man hours trying to figure out how to operate this tool and continue to run it within our environment. We don't have any budget for it and all these other things. Well, I'm here to tell you, you do not need a tool. Yes, it would make your life significantly easier if you had a tool. The tool can be your alerting. It can have automated flows and can do all of these things. There's a lot of great things that come associated with a tool. Now, we don't have a tool. The point of this demo was to look at tools that we have readily available to us. So operating system tools, we have PowerShell, we have Outlook, we have Word, we have Excel. You may have other tools within your environment that your organization has already purchased that you're able to leverage. Maybe you have Jira, maybe you have other tools like that that you could possibly leverage in order to be able to automate your processes. So automation, when you're being creative, it all starts with an idea. In order to get to the point that I was going to be able to build automation, it all started with an idea. What are the things that are constants in the program and how can I automate that? So I know I need a form. I know I need an email. I know I need to get the email back and I need to review the findings and I need to send something to the business. So all of these steps are constants within my program that I know I'm going to need to have there. And so my idea started on a whiteboard. And if you work in technology or any sort of space like that, your ideas almost always generate off of a whiteboard. Except times like now when we're at home, I don't have a whiteboard. I have a cat and he sure isn't going to help me figure out these ideas. So you have to be creative with your solutioning. You have to think outside the box and do all these other things to make your program the best that you can get it. So with that, we're going to jump into the demo. All right, so I have a demo here for you guys. The tool that I decided to leverage was Microsoft Teams. I built a channel in there that could highlight third-party risk management. So could I create a central spot for all of our employees to go to when they need to onboard a vendor? And I thought, what, Teams is awesome. It's the best thing that we could probably use. And a lot of organizations have been transitioning over to leveraging Teams. So within Teams, you can also create a SharePoint. For the purposes of the presentation, I did not do a SharePoint today. I just pointed that out that you have that option if you so choose. So we're going to go back to Teams here and we're going to look at how I set up third-party risk management within here. And you'll see that I set up the scoping form. So if you recall, that very first step that I had mentioned was scoping. What are the things that you need to know to be able to assess this vendor and do it right? So you have the vendor scoping form. Vendor scoping form identifies who's the vendor owner, who we're contacting, the contact's email, so we can email them, scope of services that they're providing. And in this case, they're providing stuff that wasn't overly expressive, I know. Will they store, transmit, process data? What kind of classification of data will they have access to? How we're transmitting it? All of those basic scoping questions that you're going to want to understand for your vendor, we'll do that as part of the scoping form. So we'll hit submit. And when you hit submit, what it'll do is it'll send it to your email. So whoever you have that form set up to you, maybe it's a GRC team, maybe it's security, whoever it is, you'll have it come into your inbox. So right away, you get a notification, hey, we have this vendor that we need to process. It gives you all the information right there. So all you got to do is click into the form. You'll be able to see all the analytics associated with it and be able to, at a quick glance, see what this vendor is about. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it down to Excel. And the reason I'm doing this is a lot of my automation was built into Excel, just because I thought it would be easier to use the risk scoring in that way. So whenever you pull down your scoping information, it pulls it down in that Excel spreadsheet that we'll go back to here in a second. So third-party scoping details, I wanted to pull those in. So I think it may be a little bit hard to see on the screen, but this Excel spreadsheet has vendor scoping, a questionnaire, it has a scorecard. So all of these different things that I want to keep in one central spot for our vendors. I wanted to do this intentionally because I don't like clicking 50 million different spots to try to find information about a vendor. I want to be able to go to one spot and get all the information that I need about that vendor. And when you work in the GRC space, what you'll see a lot is you get a lot of artifacts. You have a lot of pieces of information floating around everywhere. So path of least resistance was putting it all in one document. So that way I have a central repository of that particular vendor. So we'll continue to fill out the spreadsheet. Right now, I have a bunch of errors in this document that'll get fixed in it here in a second. We have an assessment. So you will see this again. Assessment has control references, the questions, the risk associated with the vendor to make my life easier. Again, I'm really about making my life easier here. Can I have the risk already populated in here so that it just pulls somewhere else? Can I have the risk scoring? Can I auto score? Can I do all of these things? Can I make my life easier through automation in this tool? And the answer is yes, you can make your life easier. It just takes a little upfront work. You have to be willing to put in that time, but the time is worth the return on investment of minimizing it each and every time that you're assessing these vendors. So what I'm going to do now is use the Microsoft Forms to pull in this information into the spreadsheet. So that way I have it in that central spot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use macros in order to be able to do it. So I'm going to go back and go to the vendor scoping, and I'm going to use macros to pull that information in. So now I have all the things that I need to have, and I have the vendor contact information. I have all the things. I'm going to be working with Dunder Mifflin to do this risk assessment. So we all know that Michael Scott does not know how to secure his company or run his company. So I'm kind of curious as to what kind of security issues will come back on their questionnaire. But you'll see here, I used a macro to generate this email. What it did is it automatically pulled in the risk assessment questionnaire. It auto-populated with the information that I needed and auto-populated with the person or individual I wanted CC'd. The only thing I needed to do was put the vendor contact information in there. So now I will send it out, and the third party will get this information. Let's see, third party gets the information. They are going to complete the questionnaire. So let's fast forward just a little bit here. So the vendor is going to review their questions. Do you have vuln management? Do you have patch program in place? Do you have asset management? Do you maintain flow diagrams? Do you have an information security policy? And do you understand all of your critical business functions? And so that's within the questionnaire. One other thing that I also like to do as part of my questionnaire is to facilitate it or make it a little bit easier on the third parties is providing additional information. I am super mindful that the third parties that we're talking to often is just maybe an IT help desk person or a sales representative or someone that may not have a security background. And so the goal of additional information is how can I better enable that business to return my questionnaire back to me? Because a lot of times what we'll have is vendors not completing the questionnaire or they linger on it for a really long time. So what are all the things that I can do to make my life easier? I'm not emailing them a bunch of times, they're returning it quicker. and still hitting that path of least resistance to the thing that I want to get done, which is assessing their risk. So we have that in here. Next, we'll provide responses. I don't think we need to watch typing them in here, but you can see they're going to mark no on some things and they're going to provide some responses. And then what they'll do is they will email it back to me. So I'll email it back, say, hey, here's my scores. And so let's see. Okay, there we go. So now I have received the questionnaire back. What you could do, you could save it to your desktop or wherever, or you could have a macro set up in Outlook to auto download it for you into the repository that you want, taking a couple additional steps out of it just to make it easier for you. And then it'll auto pop up. So that way you can pull the information in. So now what you want to do is make sure that the responses get into the questionnaire. Now, I'm going to put a disclaimer out here. This video that I recorded for automation, I recorded it at the tail end of 2019, at the last conference that I actually gave on this topic. Now, since then, during 2020 and a little bit of 2021, I have since improved on this particular questionnaire where it does not make sense to pull in the responses. Rose, what were you thinking? It makes no sense. So now what I have done is I've developed a brand new hidden sheet, still the same premise here that we have the risk scoring. However, the sheet is hidden and it's protected. So that way it's the same questionnaire being sent to the vendor. And when I receive it back, I don't need to pull in their scores. I don't need to do anything else because the only thing I need to do is unhide the sheet and it already tells me if their score is acceptable or not. So as you work on your automation, you're going to find where you're going to be able to improve and you're going to think, man, that was definitely a first revision. Who QA'd this for me? Here's the second version. Let's streamline this to make it a little bit easier on ourselves. So we're going to pull this information in. You can use macros to do it. So anywhere possible, use macros. It'll make your life easier. The scoring here, if they had a positive response, is going to equal 0, meaning they don't need a score for it. Or if they have a negative response, it will generate a score and it's going to give them an overall score. So here's a scorecard just demonstrating the score pulled over. They have a medium. And then we're also going to pull in their identified risks. So what are the things that came out of the risk assessment that they are going to have associated with this vendor? So fast forwarding just a little bit, what you can also do, I think I moved a little too quick, you can PDF this document. So you'll see it pops out a PDF. Here's all the things. So PDF just dumps to your desktop or wherever you want it to when you run that macro. So that's what the demo looks like. Like I said, you really can use all these different tools to build automation into your process. All right. So we also have an item that we don't talk about too much, but I do want to talk about as part of third-party risk management, and that is reverse third-party risk management. And you're probably thinking, what the heck, Rose? What is that? I have no idea what you're talking about. Reverse third-party risk management is your customers sending questionnaires to your organization. So let's say your organization provides software to other companies. Well, you are going to be assessed for your security controls as part of their ongoing compliance. And so I just refer to that as reverse third-party risk management because I haven't thought of a better way to call it. So with reverse third-party risk management, you want to reduce the burden of incoming questionnaires, meaning you don't want to spend a bunch of time answering all these different questionnaires. You want to try to have a library of responses. You want to minimize your response time because your third parties, like I mentioned, they want these questionnaires and they want them back the same way that you want it with your program. So you want to be mindful of that. And you also want to build your reverse third-party risk management in conjunction with your governance documents. Another aspect of third-party risk management or reverse third-party risk management is having your company get certified, say ISO 27001, you want to have an information security management system. You can use that to show how secure your organization is, and demonstrate that, and maybe third parties would be okay with just accepting that sort of certification. All right, so that's it. Oh my gosh, I threw so much information at you guys. I sincerely appreciate everybody for joining today. You can connect with me on any of these avenues. They're all still accurate. Ping me on the side if you want to be able to talk about anything related to third-party risk management. I am always very happy to talk about it. It's one of my favorite topics, and I've been dealing with it for quite a few years now. So with that, thank you guys, and hopefully you learned something today. Bye.